give to Nehemiah?
The walls were still down against him. The beautiful town of Jerusalem was still destroyed.
Yeah, and it's not just that this guy, comes up to Nehemiah and gives him a report. Nehemiah actually asked him about it, doesn't it? What does that tell you about Nehemiah? Why would he ask about this small group of people that lived 100 miles away from where he was living?
Did he care?
Yeah, he had to, didn't he? I mean, was Nehemiah secure in his life and in his position? He had a pretty good job, didn't he?
Maybe in his position, but not.
Yeah, he had a pretty good job. He was the king's cupbearer. And so why would he be worried about these people, that are over there? He's highly successful, obviously living a comfortable life in the situation that he's in. But what I think it indicates about him is he had a caring heart. And, when you care about people, you ask about people, don't you? You want to know what their situation is, even no matter how bad that situation might be. And so Nehemiah was a guy who genuinely cared. The report, though, that, of course, is brought to Nehemiah is instead of this great nation, we study about Israel throughout the Old Testament, one of the super nations that you read about from time to time. But instead of this great nation, you just now there was just this small group of people. Instead of this magnificent city of Jerusalem, what'd you have? Yeah, all you had was shambles and ruins. And instead of used to, when people pass by this nation and pass by Jerusalem, they talked about how great it was and talked about, the great glory that it held. But now that all they talked about was, how pitiful of a situation that city and those people were in. And the people, basically the report that's given to Nehemiah is the people are struggling to survive, and they're in great affliction in the situation that they're in. So question number 3 here on your handout, how does Nehemiah react to the news about Jerusalem and the exiles who returned?
Fasted and prayed.
Yeah. So 3 things are mentioned there. First of all, weeping. Literally, he shed tears. Tells you he cared, didn't he? He also was a guy who wanted to try to do something. And so because he had a desire to try to help these people, he prayed and he also fasted, which of course is a time of serious spiritual reflection that we read about within the scripture. But he was a guy who not only cared, but he was a guy who wanted to try to do something, to try to help these people in the situation that they were in. A lot of people today, when they hear about the misfortune of other people, they feel good about it, don't they? Or that maybe they laugh at it, especially if you're talking about your enemies or something like that. But Nehemiah was a guy who practiced the golden rule. You remember Jesus says in Matthew 7, verse 12, when we evaluate other people and we try to figure out what we can do for them, we're supposed to try to put ourselves in their shoes. And so I think Nehemiah was a guy who did that. Again, he had a good job. He was living a good life. But the fact that these people weren't emotionally touched him. And so he wasn't just emotionally affected by what was happening to them. He also was a guy who was going to try to do something about it. So question number 4 here, Nash mentioned that one of the things that Nehemiah did is that he prayed. What would you say the major theme of Nehemiah's prayer is there in verses 5 through 11 of chapter 1?
Mercy.
Okay, mercy would certainly be one of the highlights of it, wouldn't it? Any other ideas or concepts that you read about in there?
Well, the main thing seems to be that all about the covenant commands.
Yeah.
They've not followed.
Yeah, the fact that they've broken the commandments of God, well, it's basically confession of their sinfulness, isn't it? And Nehemiah really concentrates on that throughout that prayer. Why is that important? What do we got to do before we invoke the help of God? Yeah, we got to do something about our sins, don't we? And if we come to God in sin, we're not going to be able to contact Him. We're not going to be able to access His help. And so Nehemiah understands that principle. We've got to acknowledge the fact that we haven't been doing what's right. We've broken God's law. That put us in a bad situation, got carried away into captivity, got to come back, and as we read in the book of Ezra, still weren't following God's law, were they? So Nehemiah knows that there's no way that he can ever succeed in helping them without first taking care of sin. But the prayer also closes with a couple of statements that show a lot of confidence in God. Nehemiah talks about how God is faithful. These people were his servants. They were his people. And he knew that God would not forsake them if they sought him and did what was right. And so there's great confidence that he utters, even though the fact they hadn't done right in the past, there was great confidence in that if they turned things around, that God would be on their side and help them. Question number 5 here. So it's kind of interesting, but what specific request does Nehemiah ask God to grant him?
Mercy.
Okay.
And be attentive to his prayer.
Okay.
Well, actually, he was in a roundabout way asking him to be in favor of the king's favor and granting what he requested.
Yeah. He was praying for, he said that he asked for mercy in the sight of this man. Well, what man's he talking about?
The king.
The king. Right? Because he knew that if he was going to do anything about his people's situation, he had to have the permission of the king, didn't he? If the king wasn't on his side, if the king didn't grant him permission, then it wasn't going to do him any good, to try to do anything. King wouldn't allow it. But it is interesting that he prayed to God basically, to work on Artaxerxes, right? That's what we're talking about here. Work on his heart, or to work in his life when he comes before him and asks him for this certain thing, that the king will grant him that petition. But he couldn't just quit his job. That wasn't an option. He couldn't just quit and move to Jerusalem and help his people. King wouldn't have allowed for that. So he knew that he needed the king's permission. Also knows that he's going to need a lot of supplies. Go back and rebuild this. It's going to cost some money. Where are you going to get the money? Well, people are in poverty, basically. They're not going to have the supplies. They're not going to have the money to rebuild Jerusalem. And so he knows he's going to need those provisions. He also knows he's going to need some protection. He's going to need the king to side with him and do what a lot of these other Persian kings have already done for the Jews as they return back to Jerusalem. So without those things, the vision and the project that he had he knew that would never succeed. You ever been in a situation like that where the only hope that you have is for God to intervene on your behalf? It doesn't seem like a very likely scenario that if Nehemiah just goes up to this Persian king and asks him to go back to Jerusalem and help rebuild the city, and oh, by the way, will you provide the materials for it and protect us while we do it? It doesn't seem like a likely yes answer to his desire. But again, when you talk about God can accomplish anything, and so Nehemiah, knowing those things, knew that he needed God to intervene on his behalf. That's the prayer that he uttered. Not only this, I want to point this out too. Nehemiah didn't just kneel down and pray; he also stood up and worked. That's a great lesson about prayer, because sometimes in our lives, I think we pray and we ask God for certain things, and then we say, "Well, I did my part. I asked." But what did Jesus say about asking? Is there something that goes along with that? Remember what he says in Matthew chapter 7? Okay, you do have to have faith. He said you got to knock and the door's going to be open, right? What else you got to do? Seek. Yeah, you got to seek, don't you? You got to seek it out and you'll find it. So sometimes when we pray for things to happen in life, God expects us to do a little bit of seeking too. And Nehemiah was one of those guys. Didn't just pray, but he said, I'm going to go and I'm going to help and I'm going to make sure this project happens. I'm going to be involved in it. So let's talk a little bit here about chapter 2. And maybe this will get you a better timeline. If you've been with us through these studies through the Old Testament, we've kind of been trying to go through it in a chronological way. And we're basically going through the Persian kings right now and the events that happened under their reign. So, question number 6 here. At what time does this story take place?
20th year. 20th year of Xerxes.
20th year of who?
Xerxes. Artaxerxes.
There you go, Artaxerxes, right? And this is kind of important timeline-wise. If you're don't like Bible history and you don't like putting things in order, you probably won't like this part very much. But put your finger here and turn back to Ezra chapter 7 real quick with me. Remember, we just finished up the book of Ezra here. But in Ezra chapter 7, now the first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra deals with Zerubbabel and the first group that's led back to Jerusalem after the captivity. And that basically that covered 2 major Persian kings. By chance, anybody remember what those kings were? Or who those kings were? Not a Persian king history buff, I guess. Well, you remember you had Cyrus the Great. He was kind of the beginning of the Persian Empire. And then the next great king would have been Darius. You had one in between there, but he wasn't that big or that important. After those two, now that happened under the Ezra chapters 1 through 6. That's under the reign of Cyrus and Darius. And then after that, you have Xerxes. And do you remember what book fit in that timeline? Esther. There you go. That's the events, or at least biblically speaking, when you read about those, that's the Bible events that happened during his reign. And after Xerxes, then you have Artaxerxes. And so that's where we're at right now. Now, Ezra chapter 7, remember, Ezra leads a second group of Jews back to Jerusalem. And he's trying to reestablish God's law. So let's look here at Ezra chapter 7, verse 1. See if I can read this with 2 versions side by side. Now, after these things in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, there's our king we're talking about here in the book of Nehemiah, Ezra the son of Sariah. So if you go down to verse 8, it says, Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. So 7 years into the reign of Artaxerxes, Ezra leads a group back. What year are we in here in Nehemiah? 20. So how many years later is that? 13 years later. 13 years later, Nehemiah shows up on the scene. Now that's important because later on in the book of Nehemiah, we're going to read about Nehemiah and Ezra doing some work together. So you can kind of understand there's about 13-year period between these two in which they led a group back to reestablish something to help rebuild Jerusalem. Now, Ezra's main job was to reestablish the law of God. Remember, that's what his purpose was. Nehemiah is going back, though, to rebuild the wall. Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple. Remember that? Kind of set up the sacrifice and the worship. So slowly you're starting to rebuild the Jerusalem culture and the nation of Israel. But that's the kind of the timeline that we're looking at here in the book of Nehemiah. 13 years after Ezra has returned back. So, how long, anybody catch how long Nehemiah waits before he approaches Artaxerxes and asks him about returning to Jerusalem? From the time he got the report in chapter 1.
About 4 months, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was about 4 months. So that's a little bit of time, isn't it? It's not like Nehemiah didn't hear the report and the next day go up to the king and ask him. Why do you think he waited 4 months?
I was praying a lot about it.
He's been praying, hasn't he? He's been doing things to try to think spiritually, been fasting. And, I imagine he knew this has to be a right situation too for me to get a yes. And so you're not going to approach the king on a bad day. That wouldn't be very, very smart. But I think he's waiting. He's waiting for God to do something, work on his heart a little bit. Whatever events have taken place, I think now Nehemiah feels like I've got a chance at this. And so he's ready to approach the king and ask him this question. So question number 7, here's another thing we talked about when we studied the book of Esther. How had Nehemiah acted when he was in the presence of the king before this day?
Good cheer.
Yeah, he was always a good cheer. And why? You remember why? We talked a little bit about it in the book of Esther.
That was kind of a serious offense to not be in good cheer when the king.
Yeah, it was a royal commandment that when you came into the presence of the king, you were supposed to be positive and happy. And so if anybody, kings were sheltered from anyone and anything that might bring them unhappiness. Obviously, they had a lot to think about. They had a lot to deal with. Last thing that they want to do is hear about people's problems all day long. And so there is a royal law that when you came around the king, regardless of what was happening in your life, you pretended to be happy and you were positive about things. So that's the way Nehemiah was. He did his best, up to this point, he did his best to follow that law to a T. But also have to understand this. He knew that if he came into the presence of the king with a positive and a happy attitude, he wasn't going to get what he asked. And so he approaches the king. He shows he's in distress. He makes it known that he's, his countenance is sad. The king recognizes something different about him today. He's always this positive, happy person, but not today. Something's going on in his life. And so that opens a door of opportunity for Nehemiah to approach the king and ask what he needs and wants of him. So question number 8 here, again, the king recognizes Nehemiah's disposition is out of the ordinary. And so he asks him about it. He says, why are you sad? And why are you downtrodden? What's happening that's put you in this type of mood? Number 8 is this. What did Nehemiah have to overcome in order to give the king an honest answer?
He was afraid.
Yeah. Why would he be afraid?
Pretty scary.
Could be killed. Yeah. If you told the king why you were unhappy and why you were sad, and the king didn't care, he could say, you know what? You should have been happy. You should have been positive when you came around me, regardless of what's going on in your life. You've broken the law. Penalty for that is death. And so there was a real chance, and even with Esther, when you read about it, she was the queen, yeah. But hey, the king did some pretty harsh things to some of his queens we read about there in the book of Esther, didn't he? To him, they were just another object for his pleasure. And so there was a chance, even if Esther as a queen felt that way, what do you think Nehemiah as a cupbearer felt like? He was really genuinely afraid that he could lose his life. But he had to overcome that, didn't he? He had to overcome it in order to ask the king and get the petition that he wanted granted. So basically, he tells the king, he says, my home city is laying in ruin. The gates have been burned with fire. And he does something that's pretty intelligent here. He talks about, this is the city of my ancestors. And if you're familiar with Eastern culture and, death and grave sites, that was something that they considered very sacred. And so when he starts talking about, my ancestors' burial places in ruins, that would have tugged at the heartstrings of a Persian king. Because, I imagine he thought, well, what if my ancestors' burial grounds were in ruins? What would I want to do? I'd want to do something about it too. And so Nehemiah did it just like Esther in a very smart, very intelligent way, told the truth, but approached it in a very intelligent way to help tug upon the heartstrings of the king himself. And so we read about how a sympathetic spirit arose within the king whenever Nehemiah is telling him about these things. Question number 9, here's another good one. What did Nehemiah do before he told the king what he wanted?
Pray.
Yeah, he prayed. We kind of mentioned briefly, well, let's just put it this way. You ever said one of those, what's the best way to label it? One of those speed prayers? Anybody ever said a speed prayer before? You're kind of in a situation, and you say, Lord, help me. And then you go on. That's kind of where Nehemiah was. And, I think sometimes as God's children and even people, we think, does God hear a prayer like that? Will he hear Nehemiah's prayer? Yeah, he did. But I also want to emphasize this. That speed prayer was backed up by 4 months of constant prayer, wasn't it? And by fasting and other things like that. But, we can have the utmost confidence that quick prayers to God are heard. And they're answered. I mean, we have it doesn't matter the length of your prayer, does it? Is that what impresses God? What does God want? Sincerity. He wants something from the heart, doesn't he? And to be honest, I'd say sometimes those speed prayers of mine are probably more heartfelt than some of the longer ones I've said. But that's what God is after. And so we can have the utmost confidence that he answers those type of prayers. What does Nehemiah ask of the king? Question 10.
Well, I find it interesting that the king asked him, about his continence, but he also said, art thou sick? Questioning, because I assumed that if he was sick, the king would be as concerned if he was sick that it might be contagious. So being happy and not sick would be very important.
Well, I think too, he also says there in verse 2, he recognized it's not something physical, right? He said, this can't be anything but a sad heart. Obviously, if Nehemiah wasn't throwing up, or anything like that, or, doubled over in pain or something. So I think he recognizes, this isn't some kind of physical sorrow that's being inflicted, but rather emotional.
But doesn't this show a little bit, though, that there's a personal relationship between the king and Nehemiah?
Oh, yeah.
I think that there was a true personal deal with it.
Well, yeah. And go ahead.
No, you finish your.
I can finish at any time.
No, you go ahead.
I thought you might say what I was going to say, so I'm going to
No, that was.
All right, if you're not going to talk, then I will. I was just going to say, that relationship, the cupbearer to the king, what was the job of the cupbearer?
The taste, so it's poison he takes.
Yeah, he was basically a guy who was protecting the king.
Secrets.
And one of the ways, he wasn't just a guy who brought the king his cup, but he was a guy who literally tasted the king's food and drank what the king was going to drink before the king did, to make sure nobody poisoned. And so would you put a guy in that position you don't trust? I'd say they had a pretty good relationship, wouldn't you? But he trusted Nehemiah enough to appoint him to that position. Go ahead.
He's asking here, if you step back a little bit, he's asking to go to Jerusalem and rebuild the city.
Yeah.
This guy delivers drinks. I mean, I'm not saying he's trusted, but that, like, you gotta have some faith
Yeah.
that you're gonna be able to, for our knowledge, he has no experience doing any of this. He's like, I'm gonna go build a city.
Yeah.
Build some of the biggest walls in the world. You know?
I think as you read the book, though, it's pretty obvious he had some kind of building knowledge and supervision, at least. And you see it in the fact, we won't get there, we'll run out of time before we do, but he knows what he needs to do. He's not just walking on the scene and be like, okay, where do I start? Like he didn't have any idea. So the first thing that he does when he gets there is he goes out and he does it on his own, doesn't tell anybody about it. He goes out and starts inspecting everything. Okay, here's what's wrong, here's what needs to be done, here's the materials that we're gonna need, here's the manpower that we're gonna need. So I don't know what all his background was, but it kind of, to me at least, indicates, be kind of weird, wouldn't it, if he was just a cupbearer to take that project on?
Well,
I sort of think he was. I know he's a smart guy. He goes over there and figures out what he needs to do. He needs to get guys that can help him that know stuff he doesn't. But
Yeah.
I don't know how he would have knowledge of building city walls and city
Well,
factories.
you gotta remember, he had exposure to everything that the king heard. I mean, I assume that the king probably had a little drink every now and then that he needed to partake of if he was having a meeting with the builders, if he was having a meeting with the people that was taking care of the city. And he was smart enough to garner those things together and say, hey, this is how this all supposed to line up.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I don't know the background of all of it, but I know some good bakers, but I wouldn't make them builders. I think that's a pretty big leap, don't you? Go ahead, Steve, did you have a comment?
Well, I was just gonna say that the possibility of King getting assassinated by being poisoned
Yeah.
was a very real thing. So yeah, he would want to be pretty tight with his cupbearer.
Yeah.
Because that was, if he was gonna die, that's probably how it's gonna happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. It'd be a guy that you had a little bit of relationship with beforehand, I think, don't you?
But he was the cupbearer.
Yeah.
He's asking for like a ton of money.
He is. Yeah, it's a tall order that he's asking for it. So basically, yeah, he asked, I think you can kind of sum up what he asked the king in two phrases. First one is, send me to Jerusalem, let me rebuild the walls. And then the second one was, give me, give me the materials to do it. So it is pretty amazing that, and I think the king knew this too. If he was going to let Nehemiah do this, and he expected him to come back, he didn't send him over there to stay, because he asked him, he said, well, how long is this project going to take? Or how long you will be over there? But I think he knew that if he wanted this process sped up, he needed the support of the king, didn't he? And so if the king's going to give him the materials and he's going to give him the protection, then that's going to speed up the whole process itself. But question 11 here. So who was disturbed by Nehemiah's actions? Two guys we read about. We're going to read about them again in the book of Nehemiah.
You're talking about Sanballat?
Yeah, Sanballat and Tobiah, right? Almost immediately, we're just getting into the book of Nehemiah here, but almost immediately you get a hint of some of the upcoming opposition that Nehemiah is going to face in trying to do this. These were guys, I think they were probably political guys, guys in office and power. And I think one of the things is they felt politically threatened by Nehemiah. Here was a guy who got the favor of the king, and, king gave him this okay, and then gave him all these materials, and, You know, if the king's for him, then he's going to be against us. So I think they felt kind of, I think they were afraid of Nehemiah, politically speaking, that they were going to lose some of their power and their influence over the people of that area because of him. But I think they also feared Israel becoming a great nation again. Because generally speaking, for the nations that surrounded Israel, wasn't a very good time, was it? When Israel was a great nation. So, the rest of chapter 2, we're out of time here, but basically you'll read about Nehemiah inspecting the walls. You know, he'd heard about what the city of Jerusalem was like, but he needed to see the extent of the damage for himself. He went firsthand. He didn't tell anybody, any of the officials of that area about his plan. And I think part of it was because he wanted to see it in its raw form. You know, it's kind of like you ever had on your job, you ever had a surprise visit from a supervisor? Why did they show up surprisingly? Well, what do you do if you know they're coming? Yeah, you get prepared, right? And so Nehemiah didn't want this staged scene whenever he arrived. He wanted to see it in its raw form. You know, what's it really like? What's going on? What kind of work is being done? What are the things that we need to accomplish here? He does motivate them to rebuild the walls. Basically, he comes to them with a positive appeal. You know, he also used the words we and us, not you and them. That was probably pretty helpful too. Nehemiah was going to be part of this whole process. He didn't want to just tell them what to do. He was going to help them. And of course, he also pointed out, you know, God's going to be with you. The fact that I'm here and I've got the authority of the king shows you that God is with us. And so let's get to work and let's do this thing. And God's going to be on our side. Jews responded 15 positively. You know, they could have said, well, you know, I don't think things are as bad as you think they are. Or you ever talk to somebody and, you know, you suggest maybe something a little bit different and they say, well, we tried that once and it didn't work. You know, did they try to rebuild the walls once? Yeah. How'd that work out? Did it? They could have said, we've already been through this process, not going to work. We tried it. But to their credit, you know, they were positive and they said, yeah, we'll do whatever you want us to do. And of course, Nehemiah immediately experiences some opposition from Sanballat and Tobiah. And the way that they do that is they ridicule and they laugh at their, you know, look at this feeble plan that they had. This is never going to work. Look at their resources. They don't have enough resources. They don't have enough material to accomplish whatever they want to accomplish. And they even suggest that they were trying to lead a rebellion against the king. You know, they're trying to build up this city and they're going to amass this fortified city and then they're going to rebel against the king. Those were all tactics by the enemy to try to get them to quit doing God's work. And I think all of us understand, anyone who's ever worked for the Lord, if you work for the Lord, you're going to face some kind of opposition, aren't you? That's just the nature of the work, unfortunately. So how does Nehemiah respond, question 17, to those who are criticizing him? There's three things that he really made clear to those people. The first thing that he said is rebuilding the wall. This is the work of God. The second thing that he emphasizes to them is the Jews are God's servants, not yours. Okay, you may think you own us and you may think you tell us what to do, but God owns us and God tells us what to do. And then the third thing that he told them is, he said, you guys don't have any business in this. This isn't your part. This isn't your matter. This is up to us. You guys stay out of it. So, first two chapters of the book of Nehemiah. You got any thoughts, comments, questions before we end?
Why, it may be obvious, I may be too fit to understand, why is the Old Testament not written more chronologically?
More chronologically?
Yeah.
Because it's not the purpose of the Old Testament isn't to tell the chronological order of a story. It's to highlight the plan of God's salvation to bring about. And that happened through the Jews. And so really these stories that we're reading about, you know, They're stories that, and originally, maybe I should say this too, originally in the Hebrew, Ezra and Nehemiah were one book. They weren't two. And so, it's just telling a story about how God preserved this nation to bring about Abraham's seed, to bring about somebody who would bless all nations. And so its purpose is not to tell it in chronological order, it's just to highlight the things but it would be a lot more helpful to us. Maybe God purposely did that so we'd have to study a little bit, you think?